So we got a kind of a little snapshot, really, is all it was, of Sharif Kelly, one of the dissidents who is serving a sentence for the murder of Peter Butterley in Portlaoise Prison. And he's in jail. He was actually just attending a hospital appointment in Tala. He looks the worse for wear. He is one of just a few left, really, in Portlaoise. There was a time, I think, that the dissidents and the Republicans owned it. They were the kings of the wings. But he's just one of the few left.
Yeah, I mean, it was the E block. And if you remember where John Gilligan was on E1, and that was where kind of the most serious gangland were put at that stage, because this is since the ceasefire. There was no more provisional IRA in prison at the time. But the E2, E3 and E4 were all the various different dissident Republican groups at the time.
Right.
And I forget exactly the number, but it was like 45 cells per landing. And at some stage, they weren't all full, since 97. But, there would have been quite a few. You'd have had 40, 50, 60 dissident Republicans who would have still, had their own commanding officer, wouldn't be expected to work, did their own kind of system of education, and any requests to the governor had to go through the commanding officer. So they had their own kind of.
But there were there was an idea that they were really privileged prisoners. Yeah?
Well, they were considered political prisoners, and that, I suppose, was the difference with in the north of Ireland when you had IRA prisoners. There were, Thatcher and her infamous kind of attitude was they're criminals and refused
and that was
to
it.
recognise them as political prisoners.
And they went on hunger strike to fight against those.
And in the south, it was always kind of regarded as they're political prisoners, and there was a different regime. Like, they weren't treated as normal prisoners, as criminals.
And what's the status there now?
And now, as far as I can figure out, they're down to about 5.
And are they still seen as political?
No, they are still seen as political, and there would be. They would have different sort of privilege in terms of, potentially visitors, say for political reasons, for the simple reason that if somebody is suggesting we need to have lots of discussions with people because we might at some point give up the armed struggle.
Okay.
Therefore, you're going to be allowed a certain leeway on who can come and visit you. And I mean,
so other people convicted of terrorism might be allowed in to visit them, whereas that wouldn't be allowed maybe.
No, it wouldn't be allowed, if you're a drug dealer or whatever.
Yeah.
But if you're part of a political movement, and any TD or any member of the Oireachtas can go in and talk to any prisoner more or less any time, which I guess is proper order. It's a safeguard. It's it's another kind of backdoor channel for people who might be getting hard done by the system, or in this case, if they're political prisoners, if there's a reason for it. And the Fianna Fáil TD, Eamon O'Keefe, for years has kind of played that role, partly because, I guess, because of his family background, he would have the respect of Republican prisoners who would be, willing to listen or talk to him. And sort of, it's an important role, I guess, he was playing in terms of keeping the backdoor channels open so that, should there be any chance of kind of stopping all this, there would be a way to do it.
So who are the 5? We have, obviously, and we have just photographed Sharif Kelly, who's serving life, I think, for the murder of Peter Butterley. So you have Sharif Kelly and Eddie McGrath were kind of both put on trial together in the Special Criminal Court for the 2003 murder of Peter Butterley. And then Kevin Brainey was in a separate trial later on. He was also convicted. He was seen as the guy directing it, and he's the person who's considered the leader of the new IRA, certainly in the south. The other two then, there's a Sean Walsh, who's a Cork man who has, I think in the past, had a conviction for membership of the IRA. And, spent some time in prison, but he is wanted in the north on terrorism charges. He's potentially facing a life sentence there. And his extradition case is basically, I think it's gone to Europe at this stage, but he's still in prison waiting a decision on that. His extradition was ordered, I think, in 2022. Right.
But it hasn't happened yet. And then there's a man called Darren Murphy who was jailed for the murder of Eamon Kelly. Who, was the veteran gangster. He was shot dead in 2012, and Murphy, was convicted of being one of the spotters. And
now, he was shot dead by the real IRA at the time.
Yeah.
So these guys are sort of, they're within those the organisation, the real IRA, which goes on to become the new IRA?
Yeah, I mean, the real IRA and Republican Action Against Drugs, which are kind of a Derry-based organisation, they're kind of seen as having amalgamated and kind of basically became the new IRA, although there were some, I think, various pockets at different stages of people who kind of stuck with the real IRA or stuck with that name anyway.
That still exists somewhat. But that happened sort of in the aftermath of Alan Ryan's
It would have
death.
been, yeah. And there would have been kind of, I suppose the way it was characterised was that, the guys from the north were cleaning up the people who had kind of gone a bit rogue in the south and were enjoying kind of the fruits of taxing criminals in the south, and the money. They weren't focusing enough on the struggle and were too much enjoying the money and
the lifestyle, pocketing some of the money
and being the heavy around town. So I mean that's where that came out of, and even and I suppose in a sense that's where the murder of Peter Butterley came out of as well. That was kind of seen as I suppose a purging of dissidents within the dissidents. And so you have these three guys who are serving life. But Darren Murphy, even though he's in for the Eamon Kelly murder, he would have known Kevin Brainey for quite some time. They were arrested together in 2003. I think it was, I can't remember exactly what they were arrested for now. I think it was a weapons stash or something like that. But I know Brainey got off on those charges at the time because I think there was a ruling on how arrest warrants were made at the time, and so it was on a technicality. The case against him collapsed in the Special Criminal Court. But then he was then, I think, after McGrath and Kelly, Brainey went on trial then with a couple of other guys facing lesser charges. But he was also charged with the murder and with ordering it. And a lot of it came down to a guy called Dave Cullen was one of the guys arrested on the day of Butterley's murder, and he was initially kind of recruited to sort of get rid of the murder weapon, but he became a state witness and went into the witness protection program and kind of gave a kind of a picture of what happened and before the murder and how who was carrying out what role and how closely the likes of Brainey was involved in the planning and ordering the killing.
Butterley was shot dead outside the Huntsman's Inn in Gormanston in County Meath in March of 2013 in full view of students waiting for their school bus, which was sort of the headline grabbing part of it. But also was he accused then of being somebody who was pocketing money meant for the cause, or what was the fallout with him?
Yeah, it was seen as that the money wasn't necessarily going to the struggle. I think, and this was kind of the fallout, but it was also the excuse that would be used in these circumstances. It was about kind of tightening their grip and I mean, some of these guys would have had, I suppose, a past with the provisional IRA and would come with a decent reputation, for lack of a better word, among other Republicans. And so there was that kind of power struggle to kind of, somebody to get to grips with the organisation and to kind of push it in the ideological route that they wanted to go. There wasn't really a clear path, exactly, are they a right wing or a left wing group, and it was kind of a united Ireland, fair enough, and get the Brits out, and that was about the only thing I think they could agree on, and how to do it and how to go about it was entirely different. And I suppose you kind of look at them and you say, compared to the provisional IRA, they were completely incompetent, but at the same time they've done quite a bit of damage over the last 20 years.
It cost a lot of money to continue policing them. At the time of Peter Butterley's murder, this cell structure, this real IRA becoming new IRA sort of movement in disarray, is under surveillance.
Yeah, I mean that was the thing. The murder of Peter Butterley was pretty much witnessed by members of the National Surveillance Unit, the Garda National Surveillance Unit. And it was part of the reason why there was such a delay certainly in the trial of Kelly and McGrath, because they had their first trial initially collapsed because of a disclosure issue. But one of them there was arguments over whether or not these officers who rely on being totally anonymous, that they didn't want to be seen in public, and obviously didn't want their names being used. So there was various kind of arguments over that, and eventually there was a compromise made where they were to give evidence, but they weren't to be identified publicly. You couldn't report them their names, and the public were excluded at the time when they were giving evidence. And there was very tight security at the time in the special criminal, more than usual. There's a long queue. I think there was considered a real threat. Either, both to the kind of, I suppose, the state witness, Cullen, as well as somebody trying to have a look at the NSU guys as well, which you can imagine would be valuable. And you kind of think this is all a bit paranoid, but like if you remember then as well, there was a junior enough worker in the DPP's office, I think somebody who worked in, like they weren't a lawyer, they were kind of a low level administration type of worker, and they had been peeking at the various files and were able to tip off some people involved in the Butterley investigation to let them know that another person was going to be arrested, and they were successfully prosecuted as well. So I mean, there was. So when you, I suppose, laugh at the incompetence of the real IRA, at the same time, the capability to pose a real threat is there, and
their capability to kill. You were sort of totting up, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's by no means I suppose what's the word? Conclusive. But I mean, the most recent one, it wasn't actually a murder, but it was that frightening attack on John Caldwell, the inspector in Tyrone at I think they were at the kids' football.
He was taking something out of the boot, wasn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, and he was shot a number of times and very lucky to survive, and that was in February 23. But I mean, like in 2011, they killed Constable Ronan Kerr. There's David Black. It was a prison officer killed in October 2012. There's another prison officer killed in 2016, Adrian Ismay. There was a car bomb under his car and he died in hospital of a heart attack. And then, of course, you have Lyra McKee in 2019, the young journalist that was, she was there witnessing, I think, looking at covering the riots. There was some riots in Derry at the time where it is suspected the new IRA were trying to whip up young people. Now there's people facing charges in that.
That trial should be coming up soon.
In the north of Ireland, yeah. And the new IRA accepted responsibility for that. She wasn't the intended target, but again, they were shooting at the
police,
the PSNI, and she was hit by a ricochet. You have Aidan the Beast O'Driscoll, who was killed in Cork. Again, that was he was depicted as somebody who wasn't, coughing up the collection money to the movement and all the rest. So I mean, like the Butterley one was pretty callous and cold blooded. I mean, there's people who knew him that were involved, that got him killed. So, and it was very much. He was betrayed by his own to some extent, like within the movement. And this is a man who was was relatively careful. He didn't have his own mobile phone. Any messages, went through his wife's phone. This is all heard in court at the time.
Do his family dispute that he was doing anything untoward with any funds, or do they?
Well, like his wife Ethna, in fairness, like she made some very powerful victim impact statements at at different trials, and talked about the day she had to tell their young son, and she'd always remember, she'd be haunted by the scream little boy made, and that he's been robbed of having, a father, and of course she described Peter Butterley as a loving dad who was involved in going to all his daughters, sporting events and, enjoying life, and a lovely man, which no doubt he was, as many of these people are who are also involved in, armed struggle or, in that kind of, in that sort of non-constitutional politics, I suppose, for lack of a better word. And he was... She also notably, like at his funeral, there was no paramilitary trappings. So that kind of really does suggest, that certain members of the family were kind of not necessarily in agreement with his politics. I think one of us covered it at the time, and it was pretty low key. There was a couple of hundred people at it, and there was, I think, a few guards jotting down reg plates of cars, but that was about it. There was none of what we saw at Alan Ryan's funeral. Yeah. There was no colour parties, no people marching in combat jackets and berets and mirror sunglasses and, firing a volley over the coffin. There was none of that. So that does suggest that he was on his own in his politics in that sense.
I suppose the new IRA, it's interesting to see the latest developments on them. This murder of Peter Butterley happened, more than a decade ago when the organisation was in disarray. But these guys behind bars that are still given political status, they're still... highly policed, shall we say, and what happens is highly policed, especially in the north. You have Thomas Ashmellan up in the north of Ireland from Derry, who's seen as the head of the the new IRA. He was recently refused entry, I think, into Portlaoise Prison. He came down to have a meeting. Was he with Eamon O'Queeve at that stage?
No, he wasn't with him. He travelled, I think, with two other colleagues, and he'd got basically permission from a judge in Derry to allow him to vary his bail conditions, to allow him to travel down to Portlaoise, and there was various argument over whether or not he's allowed to meet people with previous convictions or connections to terrorism. So, I mean, if you're going to a prison to meet three guys serving life for murder of another, kind of included.
So Brainy would be like his equivalent as such in the South, even though it isn't such a strong group in the South, that it has to be way depleted.
I think they'd be considered certainly equals, and I mean, I as far as I can see, I mean, obviously, there is that tradition among Republican movements to revere your prisoners, that these are people who are making a living sacrifice for the cause. So, and there's always huge support, and it helps, to buoy them up and to maintain their I suppose, their morale while they're serving time as everyone else gets on with their lives. And I suppose you can be very easily forgotten when you're serving, a life sentence for murder. And so, I mean, this kind of discussion or this kind of interaction, say, between different wings, I suppose the new IRA from the north of Ireland, and then the guys in the south. I mean, it's making you, I guess it would make you feel part of a bigger structure. Now, again, I mean, in terms of, O'Keefe is making himself available as he has done for a number of years, as far as I understand, like to talk to dissident Republicans, as much to leave a route open, so that if somebody in a cabinet level wants to know what they're thinking, they can talk to somebody who's spoken directly to them, somebody who's trusted by both sides, and he's played that role. I presume. I haven't spoken to Deputy O'Keefe directly about it at any stage, but that's my understanding about how it works.
I mean, look, it would suit the political establishment. It would suit security forces for them to lay down their arms and to say they were, giving up their fight, wouldn't it? Because in the meantime, certainly in the north, there has been a huge amount of infiltration of the grouping. There's been a long-term plant put in, a guy who was bringing them on holidays to football matches. His name just escapes me at the moment. I've spoken to Alison Morris a number of times about him. There's trials happening up in the north of Ireland which are going to cost a fortune. And it's not just the cost. Obviously, the cost is to those young people that they do lure into the grouping and continue this fight. It's like as if, to me, there are people who are born in the wrong era. They're like, what are they at this point, you'd wonder, trying to achieve or hoping to achieve through violence in a country that has, rejected that?
You can make that argument all the way back to, the 1800s, when I suppose the Irish Republican Brotherhood was seen as keeping the flame alive, and the volunteer army that took part in 1916 would have regarded the IRB as these kind of secretive sort of ultra nationalists, and and it's kind of, it's over the years. Like, I mean, you would have had your various IRA campaigns in the 50s. The famous song about Sean South, Gary Owen, and all that, and the border campaign that back then that was short lived, and then obviously the whole events then from the civil rights movement starting in 1969, that, and then I suppose the split in the IRA between the provisionals and the officials, and, and then the 30 years of the Troubles that were just lethal and destructive, and, and I mean, they were always in a minority, without a doubt, while there was, I suppose, a certain amount of sneaking sympathy among a lot of people for the IRA. At the same time, they didn't necessarily want to bring their troubles to the doorstep, and I think that would be the attitude of any of the Northern Catholics I know, would be that, the Free Staters, as they disparagingly call us, like, didn't do a whole lot for them, in what they saw as their time of need, which is, look, it's one of those areas, I mean, you're going to argue out, or you're going to have discussions about what it meant and what was the point of the armed struggle and was it successful or not, and and there's, it just, you're never going to get an end to that argument.
Well, when you look at those figures in Portlaoise Prison, 5 of them, like, it's a sign, is it not, of an absolutely depleting.
It is, yeah. And if you consider the trigger man in the murder of Peter Butterley, Dean Evans isn't in Portlaoise. So, I mean, he's out of the Republican movement and he's still serving life for murder.
Yeah.
And the likes of, if you remember, Jonathan Dowdall at one point would have been in Portlaoise initially when he was I think in custody over the torture and questioning of a man they thought was trying to steal a motorbike from him. I mean, that was and he was kicked out. He was seen as too ropey for the Republicans at that stage. So I mean,
they have a bit of sense, obviously.
Yeah, and I mean, and there has, like, we know, there's been issues about whether or not some of the Republicans have had contact then with serious criminals. None of the ones we're talking about here, but in the past, in the relatively recent past, and they've been kicked out of, or supposedly looked for transfer after fears that they were being falsely accused or whatever of having contact with more serious, with gangland criminals inside to help them smuggle drugs or phones or any kind of contraband, that kind of stuff, which is seen as kind of being beneath you. But sorry, actually, there's one thing we skipped over there a bit. I know you asked me, and I kind of got sidetracked. We were talking about the cost of policing them, and there was some interesting stuff that came out when you consider it was 10 years ago in the Peter Butterley trial. Like one of the argument was that the guards were trying not to give evidence over a tracker that was used. So it was the first time that I think it had been admitted that the guards had used electronic tracking devices on vehicles, and there was also evidence about listening devices being placed in a KFC restaurant so they could hear these guys chatting a couple of days after the murder, and this including Brainy, and this is all used in the evidence against him as kind of having had foreknowledge of the killing. So it just shows you kind of, I suppose, the amount of effort
that must go into that with the National Surveillance Unit,
and just the numbers of people tied up in it. And you're talking about,
what do you do as a state with the history we have and in the North? You can't just sort of go, there's spent force, we ignore them. You have to stay on them until the moment that they say, and you believe that they have literally put to bed their armed struggle.
Yeah, and
they're a small group of people that are creating a huge amount of havoc and expense for the state, and you have to handle them with kid gloves at the same time. Give them the political status, and should they decide to come to the table, you have to facilitate that in any way you can.
Yeah, well, I suppose in a way, that trail has already been blazed by the provisional IRA in the past, and that in the long run, you're not going to solve it by policing alone. You have to kind of wait for these kind of, if you want to refer them as political dinosaurs, to die off, which I don't think is necessarily going to happen. But I mean, you have to, if you have people with extreme political views, that at least they stay non-violent. But if you have people who are committed to armed struggle, like to further their aims, then you really do have to keep a close surveillance, and you do have to put in a lot of resources, and probably some of your best officers, men and women, like who are going to be tied up doing this kind of work that we would like to see, against some of the drug cartels or some of the the serious some of those operators in the south. If those techniques were being used, like, I mean, who knows? They could well be. And you could
every year about these guys getting to choose what they want for Christmas dinner. Is it just one of those seasonal stories, or do they have that ability to order in?
There was in the past, all right. I'm not sure at the moment, but there was definitely in the past. I mean, you can get stuff sent into you anyway in prison. I mean, they're going to obviously keep a certain amount of tabs on what you're getting sent in.
I would just wonder if these 5 decided they wanted some particular, does everybody else not get a bit jealous of them and a bit
I'm sure they do, but but I suppose your ordinary prisoners aren't going to mess with them in the basis that they still might have the capability to cause you some hassle on the outside, or your family if you do something on the inside. Because they are still a group, albeit small and not as powerful, but they're still a group. And so, I mean, if an individual takes on a group, you're never going to really, it's not going to work out. But I wouldn't imagine that the likes of any of the Kinnan cartel-linked people are in any way worried about these guys. They'd see themselves as just as powerful, if not more so, even in their current depleted state. And some of the other connected gangsters probably much the same. And then there'll be other that we might consider ordinary decent criminals that come from a decent sized network themselves, who just, it doesn't bother them. They're not frightened of these guys. They're not going to find them easily anyway. If they want to do something in the outside, and probably will be biting off more than they can chew. It
feels like just in the next few years that we mightn't be speaking about them anymore. That's what it feels like.
It's hard to know, because I would imagine it's it's going to, you would imagine it's going to go that way. But as, I suppose, discussion of a united Ireland becomes more intense, and as the discussion about what do we want our vision of a united Ireland to be, it could lead to anything. Like, if somebody say, no, we're going too far to bend over to the British, or the people who identify themselves as British, and other people saying, no, we're not going far enough. And who knows what way
you could see an upsurge of popularity again.
It could infuse life. As you say, it doesn't take a lot. But you do imagine, though, the number of people now with kind of, experience with the provisional IRA that's any use to any of these dissident Republicans is fairly minor. That it's going to be people with more gangland, like criminal experience, that'll be useful to somebody who wants to start the armed struggle, as opposed to somebody who was once a volunteer for the provisional IRA or something like that.
For sure. Okay, Eamon, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola. It was a pleasure.